peripheral, you're sort of like overhearing it vaguely to create that ambient awareness. At least that's the way I'm reading the setup here. So, for coming. So the topic here, I thought I would just kind of introduce how I think about this, maybe 10 minutes of context, and then, I don't know, we can make it a discussion, or we can do some group brainstorming exercises. We can take it from there. So the context here is how to have a research mindset. So this is something that came up a lot in my work at the Ink and Switch Research Lab, which is if folks come from, let's say, industry or anything other than sort of the research world, it's actually a whole different way to think about making a tool or making a digital product. And on the surface, it looks very similar. I think if you're talking about science, more basic sciences, for example, medicine, I think it's pretty clear that a medical researcher and what they're doing with an experiment to see if, for example, a treatment would help with a disease is very different from what a clinician would do. A doctor should not be experimenting on their patients. They should be giving, really well-known treatments. And I think that just looks very different in terms of what you actually do. Whereas I think when you're doing research in the digital space, it actually does look similar in the sense that in both cases, you're probably writing a piece of software, or maybe you're doing some user research, or you're doing some design work, and the end thing might be a thing on your screen, but when it's research, it's a totally different thing from when it's designed to be an end product. So I thought actually to start with this question of like, what actually is research? And this is not something that I'm necessarily saying there's a right answer to. I've got sort of my answer, but I'm first would be curious to have folks just throw out their answer to that question. What qualifies as research, or what's a definition for that? No thoughts? You can put it in the chat if you want, or speak it.
Sorry, Adam, could you repeat the last question?
Yes. What is research? How do you define research? And thinking of digital products, making software, for example, what's the difference between making a piece of software for research and making it for, commercial product?
Right. So this isn't a fully articulate thought, but research, the way I think of it, is really just thinking about a specific problem, or gathering ideas around a specific topic that you're thinking about, and just sort of you always start somewhere, right? You've got some information. You never start with a blank slate. So it's really curating information, I guess, in some sense, and making sense of a bunch of information that you already have in the context of what you're thinking, or in the context of the problem you're thinking about.
Other thoughts? Experimentation? So my definition is that the purpose of research is to answer questions and to discover the unknown. Again, I don't necessarily claim that that's the right answer, but it is what I like to work with. So answer questions, discover unknown. And I think you see this in your own life. There's just something simple as like researching a product you might want to buy, or, for example, to use the medical field again, your a friend or family member has come down with a serious illness. You want to go learn about what the impact that is going to be on their life. But I think The questions one is a pretty big one in the sense that any sort of proposal for a product, typically you're talking about solving a problem. But any research proposal, I think, should be what questions are we answering? What information what things do we expect to know at the end of this that we didn't know before? And certainly in human-computer interaction and digital tools, we typically answer those questions by building things. Not always. User research can be a huge source of information there. But, right, Maggie says discovering unknowns. And that can lead you into the known unknowns and unknown unknowns, for example. Yeah. And so, yeah, so I think starting there, and then when you think about, for example, building a prototype of something, you're thinking in terms of how do we get information that we didn't have before? Finding the right questions, another good one. I thought that two examples here, and these are obviously pretty technical just because Ink and Switch is a human-computer interaction lab and is focused on a lot of computer science type questions, but I think these things can apply to other kinds of general research as well. So two specific examples that we have looked at before is this first one here. I should be using my center pen. So this first one here is basically pairing two devices. And one of the ways that actually we find interesting research questions can be that we are, where do I have this? Actually, I think I do. One of the ways that you can find new research is by basically new constraints. So in this case, we were saying without using the cloud. So for example, Bluetooth would be a way to pair two devices that might be near each other without using the cloud. Another example we had that's more on the kind of user interface and design side is this one here, which basically we were making a kind of collaborative whiteboard prototype. And we had this question of, okay, you need to enter your name. How do you do that without using a keyboard? And so, or having a physical keyboard that you would typically have attached to a computer. You're on a tablet, you don't have that. One obvious example is the on-screen keyboard. And part of what's interesting about this to me is that when you are, again, in the product mindset, you are thinking in terms of how to do the conventional thing or the best practice, right? So, for example, we'll look at this one over here. So there's on-screen keyboard. If folks want to call out some other ideas, so another one is like audio entry, right? So you turn on your, I guess it would be a voice transcription. Maybe there's something like basically copy pasting it from someplace else with the keyboard. Those are some of the different ideas you might have. And then again, over here, how can you connect two devices? Okay, there's a QR code, and then using the local Wi-Fi would be another one. So the reason I chose these two examples is in both cases. Okay, so Meyer asks, I'm pronouncing that right, are these questions or problems to be solved? Yeah, I guess I think they end up looking like problems in the sense of you're asking the question of, can this be done? Might be one way to put it. But another way to put it is, first there's, can it be done? And then second, sort of what is a good way to do it? And along the way, and I'll show some other examples of this, but along the way of trying to answer that question or trying to discover that, you're probably going to also find new things that you didn't even guess were questions that you had in the beginning. In many ways, uncovering new questions, right? I'm thinking of the XKCD, that every research paper always ends with further research to be done, because you basically, in answering some questions and doing some discovery, you you get new questions as well. Well, anyways, I just wanted to show these two quick examples because both of them, I think, ended up in slightly unconventional places. And this, to me, is the crux of the research mindset and something we went through with a lot of folks that came to work in the lab from industry, which is in industry, you always think, what is the best practice way to do it? What does the Apple Higgs say? What does everyone else do? What do users expect? Principle of least surprise. And I think in the research world, you actually want this more divergent thinking. So in the case of the pairing two devices, one path we ended up going down was something called audio ultrasonic modems. And you can see, actually, here's a library we ended up using. So what this actually does is plays an audio, kind of like an audio QR code, but it does it using your computer speaker, but at a frequency that humans cannot hear. And so this is sort of the kind of weird researchy stuff that I always enjoy. And it actually works moderately well as long as the information content is pretty low. And furthermore, it can actually work over video chat because you can actually play it through there. And I guess that's what this sort of discovery process is to me, which is like starting with a question that potentially has some interesting constraints. And then you start with the most conventional answers, and then you try to think of weirder and weirder things until you end on potentially. Now, many times going down this process, I think you do end up on, you actually realize that the conventional way of doing it is the best way to do it, but I think that's not always the case. On this one, we actually ended up, here's a screenshot of this prototype that we were working on, and you can actually see here what we ended up with was an interface where you write your name. And so you have this little name tag. And the thing is, that would not work at all depending on some other context. So if you were in like an email program, obviously scribbling your name, or even just like drawing a little smiley face or something would totally not work. But in this case, you have a small set of people who are collaborating together. They just need to be able to tell each other apart. And so they each have a color and they can write their name into a name tag. It doesn't need to be long. It doesn't need to be super legible. It just needs to be a way to identify people and tell them apart in this particular setting. So I felt like that was a kind of a fun and good example of where kind of breaking away from the kind of conventional expectation of what you would normally do to identify yourself or kind of label your avatar in a collaborative environment using the affordances of that particular environment or the different constraints. So I'll show you the method that we kind of use, or that I personally use at least, kind of in the ink and switch world of things, but I'd be curious to know how this compares to others. So I kind of have this five-step thing, starting by defining the problem or the question, which has been pointed out. You could argue that those are sort of different, but I do think in general, you're doing research to see, or another way to put it is the industrial research that we do at Ink and Switch. We're not just kind of like generally searching for truth. We actually do think that there are problems to be solved. For example, how do you create a collaborative environment that also preserves privacy? Might be one example. So you could frame that as a problem, but I think once you go into the research mindset, it becomes a question, or a set of questions. And this first one here, I think is probably true of sort of product management in, what's the word for it? Kind of the commercial world, which is you should always like write the problem down separately from the thing you think you want to build, which can be hard for builders to do. Then another huge one that I think is always a good idea, but especially true in the research world, is surveying prior art. And so just an example of that here, which is, this was again kind of in like a collaborative whiteboard sort of space. So this is a brief for an older project here. And so often this stuff starts with something like someone saying, well, obviously we need to add a laser pointer, some way to gesture in the space and indicate, where someone could or should look on the whiteboard. But that's starting with the solution. And so here, what we actually did is kind of like really like go back to basics and look at what do people do when they want to draw attention to something in a visual aid, right? And, in a way, this is kind of fundamental, but it's a good starting place. And then prior art, which is why I wanted to show this. So one of the things here, I think Maggie actually referenced the folk practices. This is one of my favorite places to draw, could call it like more ethnographic research from, but you see people repurposing things for a purpose they weren't meant for. And so a good example is when you're on screen share on a desktop computer, highlighting text over and over again, or a Google Doc, you might do this, wiggling your mouse cursor to kind of like show where something is. That's like a very common way to kind of draw attention to a particular side of things. And then you can just go look at other products. For example, here's a little kind of whiteboard app for the iPhone that has basically a laser pointer type thing. There's probably more. This was 5 years old now, so there's probably more up-to-date examples of this. And then that leads you to, thinking about the solution. So, so the prior art survey is one of the biggest items that I think is easy to skip over, because in a way, people have done the research for you. Because your goal is to like get knowledge and answer questions. If someone already built it, particularly if you can find an old failed product or an old research paper or something like that. And I think that, again, comes naturally to people who are in academia, because you're supposed to be building on the knowledge that others have found. But it comes harder to people that come from the commercial world, especially the startup world, where there's this kind of inbuilt naivety of, hey, I could build this awesome thing. I'll just go build it. I won't go look for what others have already done. I'll quickly read the comments in the chat here. Right. So, just to go back briefly, the solution of how do you identify yourself? And you're right here, in a way, we're sort of enter your name actually is a mistake, because you're specifying a solution, but maybe in writing that question, we almost kind of implied that, well, of course, you're in a digital space, you should have a textual representation of your space. That's the normal thing you should expect to do. And in thinking a little bit more divergently, and in particular looking at the constraints of the environment, you don't have a keyboard, but also things like the qualities of the environment, such as there's only 5 people in the room. Okay, there's probably not a bunch of atoms. So if I just scribble atom, people are not going to have trouble identifying them. Yeah. Anyone want to jump in with thoughts or questions at this point? Yeah, so I think the rest, is fairly fair. No, please go ahead.
Just had a question about how you position number 2 about serving prior art. Do you think that biases your future thinking, especially about points 3 and 4 and 5 about your own solution, when you have the framework of what have people done in the past?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the things I think is, and again, I'm realizing as I talk this through now, that a lot of this comes from the perspective of me as a person running a research lab, having people come in from the academic world and they have a research perspective. And so they kind of know how to think this way. And then lots of people from my network that are more from the startup world coming in and then being surprised by this kind of approach to developing things. But one of the things I actually do think is good about the startup world is exactly the point you make, which is there's almost a forced naivety, which is like they're typically pretty young people. They don't know what was built before. They just think, hey, we could build a new thing. And often that naivety is what allows them to make something breakthrough, I would say. Because, for example, constraints that maybe existed 5 or 10 years ago don't exist anymore. So someone more experienced, would say, that can't be done, or people have tried that a bunch of times and it's never worked, but actually something's changed about the world or technology such that it is possible. So I do think a kind of naivety and a kind of blank slate open-ended mind perspective can be valuable. But I think that almost always the first thoughts you're going to have in thinking about a problem are things that other people have tried before. And so in a way, you get to skip forward, I think, in the sense that like you think of the obvious solution, like, in the pointing case, the laser pointer concept, I think is sort of the obvious solution. It's the first thing almost any smart person thinking about this will think of. But it turns out there's a bunch of products out there that have that. You go try it and you realize it kind of sucks. You're like, okay, well, now we can skip over needing to build that to find out how it feels or to find out what it's like to use in practice because others have built it for us. And now we can try to like look at, okay, what doesn't work about that? And now we can skip forward to more interesting solutions. So hopefully the survey of prior art doesn't become a way to, again, kind of land on a conventional thinking or a best practice, but rather a way to see what works and doesn't work, but particularly what doesn't work, I think, because if you can think of an obvious solution, probably someone else has made it before. Might as well go see that.
I'm curious, at Switch, do you set limits on how long you research before you're like, we've done enough? Because, I mean, obviously, coming from the academic side, right, people will research till they're blue in the face, right? They're like, I need to do research for 4 years before I can even begin to consider building an interface. So do you have a sort of forcing function to make you be like, okay, we get enough and we're just going to have to try and build with what we know?
Yes. Well, and notably, I count the building as part of the research project, but there's sort of two answers to that. Well, the way I would answer that question is basically time boxing. And that is also connected to, we don't have very much money. So, but that sort of requires us to be scrappy. But the way that we run projects typically is we'll do maybe something like 2 to 3 months. And so the idea is you don't like kind of come up with a project proposal and then say, what kind of time and budget do we need for that? Instead, you say, we think this problem is interesting enough to spend 3 months of 3 people's time and what that implies on, okay, how are you going to spend that budget? And it forces you to kind of chunk things. And there's some objections to it. Something that has come up is people feel sometimes that the forcing this kind of fix, it's almost like what's the word for it? The standard size container for research. Maybe there are things that just don't fit into that box. But my experience has been it just forces you to break a problem down and like, what's a meaningful thing that we can do, we can build, we can learn from, and then publish about, and then we can build on. In fact, we do have chains of projects where, we essentially, I guess it's sort of the iterative mindset from the commercial world, but trying to bring that to research and perhaps forced a little bit by our economic constraints. Is there another comment or question out there?
I wanted to get more detail on these feedback arrows between step 2 and step 3. That seems to be where some of the magic is happening. You're looking at the prior art, you're saying, I figured it's not good, and somehow it's making you do divergent thinking.
Yeah.
Could you give an example or?
Yeah, I can do that. So one of the ones we looked into quite a bit on these, and I don't want to over-index on the sort of, tablet whiteboard space stuff, but I happen to have a lot of examples of that top of mind. So another one there was this realm of what's usually called the infinite canvas. So this is something like design tools like Figma and Illustrator. You basically have like this 2D canvas where you can zoom in and out infinitely. And in making kind of a digital whiteboard or kind of spatial drawing ideation space, something like that sounds very appealing. And so we did some, looked at that element of things. It's even something like, what happens when you, I'm not sure with the QuickTime setup, but if I was to rotate my tablet right now, what happens with this space that I'm looking at? It's kind of non-obvious. And so it turns out that The obvious thing you would want is, oh, an infinite canvas. That sounds amazing. A whiteboard, but I never run out of space. I never get to the edge, and I can zoom way, way out and see everything, and I can zoom in super closely. Turns out there's actually a bunch of apps in the App Store and web apps and other things that offer kind of sketching spaces that work this way. And if you try them, and we also did user tests with them, basically user testing other people's, products, which is another good trick for, getting useful research without needing to build something. What we actually found was, in theory, an infinite canvas sounds great. And in practice, you get lost. It feels very disorienting. You don't have a sense of scale. You don't know where the edges are. You're in this giant white void. And so that led to, so that's a good example of where, okay, infinite canvas, obviously that's the thing you want. Okay, we go find some examples of that. We try them out, or even usability test them with other people, and we find there's this gap or this problem. And then we can kind of articulate that, gives us some sub-questions or sub-problems to then try to think divergently about. And that in turn, actually it's happened more than once that I've gone in to work on a research proposal in the process of thinking about what the solution should be, and then going and looking and then going and looking for prior art solutions on that. I actually discover a great product that exists where I'm like, oh, actually this totally answers what I need. There's no need to do the research. It exists. I just didn't know about it before. So it's totally happened, and we ended up just basically stopping the research project. Of course, you can also go the other way, which is you find prior art, either failed products in the market or academic research that you can go check out. You realize, okay, someone already did this. It's actually a dead end. There's actually no point to pursuing the research. But I think that's what this, this kind of positive feedback loop is. Looking at the prior art gives you new kinds of insights and, sub-questions and so on. And then that in turn, you can then do divergent design thinking around that. And then at some point you reach the frontier, you reach the end of, what's available, and you discover there is a next step in that chain. Okay, here's what the next kind of solution might be, but actually it looks like, at least from what we can find, no one's built that before. Okay, that's our project. Now we're going to build a prototype of this thing as far as we know has never been tried, and now we have truly novel research and something unique we can kind of contribute to the body of knowledge in the world. And that unique thing we may contribute may be, a negative finding in the sense of this doesn't work. But we think that's a positive contribution versus just rebuilding something that someone already did 10 years ago and it turns out it works or it doesn't work. So hopefully these last two steps are fairly obvious. Once you're to that point, as we just described, you actually devise your experiment to run, which is probably building a thing, and then usability testing it is typically what it is. And then, reporting. And honestly, actually is a tricky thing, again, for people coming from the industrial and commercial world where, if you're writing a blog post for your startup about your product, yay, it's so great. And you just talk about all the things that are good about it. You're selling it in a way. And actually, people can feel this way about research projects, and they do by default. You spent even just 2 months building a thing. You're emotionally invested in it. You like it. You think it's great. And so you necessarily are almost inclined to sell it or pitch it or cheerlead for it. And so one of the things I really encourage people to do, something I learned to do myself, that maybe didn't come so naturally, but which is to report honestly on your findings in terms of, yeah, we liked this project, but here's, some things that seemed really good about it, but also here's, some flaws. There's one example from a recent Switch essay, and that includes just random stuff you trip across that has nothing to do with your project. So one thing we actually quickly discovered this is in the Muse white paper, kind of before it was a commercial product, it actually had nothing to do with the thing we built. We just discovered lots and lots of people would lose or run out of batteries on their stylus. So at the time, this was wasn't on the iPad platform. It was using a Chrome OS. And this was just a very frequent thing. We had our kind of small base of test users or whatever, and we would use this stuff. And we would basically go and say, oh, hey, can you try the latest feature for me? And they'd say, oh, yeah, I'm checking it out. Oh, wait a minute. Where's my stylus? It rolled off the desk. It's under oh, I've got it. Oh, it's out of batteries. which I thought, wasn't a thing we set out to learn about, but it was just a practical thing. If you expect to make a thing that people are going to use where the stylus is required, okay, this is actually a real problem. Now, since then, this has actually been solved by the iPad and their sort of magnetic attachment for the stylus. But to me is a good example of a negative finding. It's just sort of something you're kicking over stones in space. So that's our method, at least. And I hadn't fleshed this out too much, but if folks are interested, we could try to do some brief research thinking. And obviously we can't, survey prior art and that sort of thing. But I think, maybe in some ways the key things here are really just like divergent and, you say like out of the box, that sort of thing, kind of breaking conventional thinking, trying to either add constraints or remove constraints to do something different. I always like the I think it's kind of a canonical example now, but something like the iPhone, where Steve Jobs created this constraint of you got one button, and at the time the BlackBerry was the world's top mobile device, and it had a full hardware keyboard and lots of buttons is kind of defines what computers are. And they saw that with capacitive touch, there was an opportunity to do something with fewer physical buttons, and that might make a good experience. But yes, I don't know if folks are into this, but if you want, we could potentially come up with some research questions or some design problems, and try to do a little bit of get ourselves into the research mindset on this. Great. Now, I actually ran out of time when I was supposed to come up with what might be some good questions to work on here. So I can probably think of some quickly, but even better would be if someone else on the group here, maybe you have something in your own work, product you're working on or a space you're working in. What is an open, an open question that you think you'd like to apply a research mindset to? And it doesn't have to be research, doesn't have to be academic, doesn't even have to be a product. Could be something in your life, because I think this is a very general purpose methodology.
Yeah, so I have an interesting problem that I think would be awesome for this mindset, which is creating data sets for machine learning, right? And I'm thinking specifically about computer vision, because that's the field I work in. But really, the way I see it, it's like training the models is, there's enough best practices by now to the point that you can automate it. So it's like, to really create new interesting applications, it's all about creating a good data set. And that doesn't require technical expertise, but that's where domain expertise comes in. So data labeling tools are really very technically driven, or driven by large companies, or they're built for large companies. But I think the scope for a tool that can actually help you think about what kinds of problems you can tackle, So this is something sorry, you were going to say something, Adam.
Yeah, no, I'm trying to get a shorter summary here. So, training models. Can you give me like the one sentence summary?
Yeah, the canonical example is like automatically recognizing the difference between a dog and a cat, right? So the way you do that is collect a few hundred images of a dog versus a few hundred images of a cat, and once you have this data collected, training the model can be automated away, right? So here, here the focus becomes defining what problem you want to tackle, right? Now this dog versus cat can also be extended to, malignant versus benign tumor, right? Or different plant species or animal species.
Yeah, I think the canonical the sort of like machine learning thing is the recognizing the different flowers based on some of their properties, like the petal length and that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's one of them. Yeah.
Okay, good one. Let's see. I'm just grabbing out of the chat here as well. We've got how to incorporate best practices into education best practices. And exploring tab management in browsers. Yeah. All right, nice list. Yeah, let's see here. What do I feel like I'm best qualified to? Actually, Meyer, could you expand on the best way to give advice to the user question? If you want. All right. Well, let's zoom in on this the training models one a little bit, since we have the most information there. Maybe. Yeah. So the idea here would be, for example, potentially you can imagine that a research project to create a prototype that's essentially like a data entry tool, right? I guess the obvious, I assume the state of the art there is going to be. Oh yeah. Jumping in, Meyer. Sorry. Yeah. So tell us so let's, if we come back to this a little bit. So defining the problem in absence of the solution, I think, is, let's put this down actually. Yeah. So what is we'll call this the problem. So what's the kind of state of the, give us a really brief summary of the prior art. What do people use today for this kind of like creating these data sets from expert domain knowledge?
Sure. One state-of-the-art labeling tool is called Label Studio. There's two kinds of tools you need here, right? One is for labeling data. The other is for training the model. Training models is, there's great developer tools for it. And, there's high-level frameworks where you can just, provided your data is organized, you can just write a few lines of code and train a model. So FastAI is a really popular one over there.
FastAI, you said?
Yeah, FastAI and Ice Vision as well. Yeah. There's also a tool that was bought by Microsoft, a company called Lobe, which actually packages this problem together. But I haven't had the opportunity to use it extensively, and I also know that it just solves a specific kind of problem and has
LOW?
LOBE.
Yeah.
My bad.
Data classification.
Or Lobe Microsoft might give you a sure result. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. So actually, I've seen this one before.
So this one does what's called image classification. So it's like you just provide one label to an image. Whereas there's more advanced kinds of things where you can do object detection. So actually detect, say, people in the image and where exactly they are, right?
And of course, we can't forget the canonical example, which is hot dog, not hot dog.
yeah, that's
Silicon Valley TV show reference. Okay, so obviously we don't have time to go in depth here, but since you are, since you know these well, what would you say is the sort of the, I don't know if you call it the pros and cons exactly, but what can we learn from these existing tools, and what's missing, or what's what sucks about them might be another way to put it.
Yeah, so while Label Studio is great for people who know what they're doing or work in the area, what sucks is you need to have you need to know what you're doing to be able to leverage it, and that's just that's a huge problem, I think, because a good tool should be able to empower anyone that just wants to think about, like, okay, I want to distinguish between these two. There's this pattern I see in these images that I have, right? And I want to be able to distinguish between them automatically. And you may do that naturally by just putting them into a set of different folders. And ideally, what you'd want is to have a model just learn how to do that for you when you give it new images. So the major con is it requires a lot of technical context to be able to use.
Yeah, and one thing I think that is, again, since we can't go into super depth here, but the kind of prior art survey I would normally do, in addition to things like pulling screenshots and stuff like that, is, basically either using myself or you're watching other users use it, and then you're sort of like pulling out these smaller observations. A lot of times the best insights, I think, kind of lead from not just a broad statement, but more like a detail where they say, I really hate this one little thing.
Right.
Yeah. All right. Well, again, won't go super deep in there. So then if we wanted to go to the divergent thinking stage now, what for you do you start to think about that are things that potentially have not been done before, or that solve the problem you just described?
I might have to think a little longer on that one.
Well, yeah, that is the tricky bit with this, for sure. I think this is, the sort of thing that you do over, multi-hour sessions, days of thinking, going back and forth with people. And I get a lot of my, I think, best sort of thinking through more pattern matching. So in the prior art thing, if you're collecting, for example, a lot of user quotes, and then you're looking for patterns across that. Yeah. What's a specific example of where these tools don't empower the non-experts?
So I can't speak extensively to Lobe AI because I've only heard of the tool and I haven't used it. But as for the others, it's just the fact that you need to be a programmer to be able to build AI systems, right? And Lobe is a solution to that. But again, I haven't used it extensively. But I also know that it's defined for specific use cases, Whereas really what you'd want is, you don't want to define the problem before you start to tackle it. You want to just be able to bring in a bunch of images that you have, for example, and be like, okay, here's a few interesting patterns in these, and how can I go about meaningfully separating them? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So I think you pointed to, though, also an interesting place where, you described something specific here. You need to be a programmer to use these systems. There might be benefits. And then that leads to a natural question, which is, one, can you make a system that a non-programmer can use, but also is powerful enough or useful enough? And then two, what value does that provide to them? But then in the process of doing that, you might see that maybe this one seems to be designed for that purpose. Now you can go try that, and then you can see what they've learned, what works, what doesn't work. As you sort of envisioned, it would be better if a non-programmer could use it. But then if you try to use it in particular, maybe if you go and user test that with some people, you might learn some things. And again, you can, rather than duplicating work they've already done, you can build upon that work.
Yeah.
Great. Maybe we have time for one more. Does someone else want to propose? Does someone else have a interest in one of these three we've already discussed, or know that they want to propose? Yeah, I realize it is a very kind of shallow thing to try to spend 10 minutes to apply this method when it's really something that requires deep thinking over the course of days and weeks, but just to get a feel for it.
Not sure how to proceed.
Yeah. Who threw out the education best practices and software tools?
I threw that one out.
Yeah, can you expand on that a little bit?
Sure. So it came out of I've been learning machine learning on YouTube courses, and also picked up this book talking about how to learn effectively. And they gave us different ways, educational best practice. For example, there's a spaced repetition, which you probably heard of, and then there's something called retrieval learning, which is creating these questions based off what you learn and testing yourself just to make sure that you can. It's kind of like explain it like on 5 sort of thing. It brought me thinking like, okay, YouTube is such a great resource, but then when you want to learn effectively from these great resources, you have to bring in different sorts of tools that may not might not incorporate well into the mediums that you're using to learn. So I'm thinking, is there a way to extend the mediums that you're using to incorporate these tools, or is there a way to extend these mediums in a way that's natural to these tools that incorporate educational best practices?
Okay, maybe yes. I'm not fully following, but maybe you can make it more concrete. Can you speak about what's an example of so you mentioned spaced repetition. That's an education best practice, or you see that as a software tool that is missing an education best practice?
Okay, I see that as both. If you have a concrete example, so like you're learning some math topics from a YouTube channel called 3 Blue 1 Brown, which is very popular. And so after you're finished, there's no sort of a forcing function that makes you apply these best practices to what you learn. You have to kind of do it yourself. There's no program that kind of makes that kind of leads you towards doing that. For these educational or like Coursera platforms or anything like that, they all just provide the content, but they don't provide the educational part. Yeah.
So the thing that immediately comes to mind for me in education environment is, you go to class and then afterwards there's a test or you have to write an essay or something. You have to apply what you've just learned. And obviously when you watch a YouTube channel, which might be for entertainment as much as it is for education, but there's no exercise at the end that causes you to apply it. Is that, am I getting warm with that?
Oh, that's exactly it. Yes. Yeah.
And certainly the sort of Andy Matchek's work with trying to improve books by basically incorporating or essays, I guess, by incorporating spaced repetition is maybe one example of that. And of course, he's a good example of someone who is very much applying a research mindset, which it isn't just, there's a very, you could take a perspective of how do we improve spaced repetition? Like, how do we take, a flashcard system and make it better? Or you could think in terms of like, how could we improve this education YouTube channel? Well, maybe we could explain things more clearly. But yeah, and I really like this also because I think actually one of the best places to get good ideas in divergent thinking is putting together two, what's the word for it? Not quite unrelated domains, but two domains that maybe don't have a lot of crosstalk. So I think, let's say teachers and product designers might be one way to put it. Maybe this is the reason why, say, Seymour Parpet's work was so powerful at the time, and things like the logo programming language was bringing what he knew about child psychology and about sort of teaching and education to especially back then in the 70s or whenever it was, to the world of computer science and software engineering and all that kind of stuff, which tended to be very, very far away from that. Since I know we're pretty low on time here, but if we were to run through kind of that, this research thinking process here, in a way, I think it seems like this is more of I would call it like a prompt or a provocation, which is not saying, is there some specific